Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be back. I never get asked back, so this is a real treat for me. I have to tell you, the first service, I had a painful memory. I saw these kids up here, and I realized there's a lot of kids in this church. And during the first service, they flashed up there, somebody's social security number or something to go get their kid. It reminded me of a time I was preaching. I was in the middle of a sermon, and I don't even remember what I said. I don't even remember what I was preaching on, but at one point in the message, with one accord, probably, 20 people stood up and walked out. And I didn't know what I had said. These days, there's no telling. I mean, you're only one careless word away from a peaceful protest of some kind. And so I didn't know what I had said, but it bothered me the whole rest of the time I finished the sermon. And boy, no sooner did I come off the stage, our head nursery person came running down the aisle to me. She said, "Oh, Pastor, I am so sorry. We used, what do you call those things? Like, what are they? Vibrating pagers, that's it. We used pagers. And so she came running down to me, and she said, "I'm so sorry." She said, "The person that was trying to get somebody accidentally pushed page all, and every parent in the place got paged." And so, that was actually good news for me. I want you to think back over your life and revisit a time when God spoke to you. Has there ever been a time in your life when God spoke to you? I'm not talking about an audible voice. I've never heard God's audible voice, but there have been a handful of times in my life where God was saying something to me and it was unmistakable. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, actually it was in the suburbs of Chicago. After I felt that God was leading me towards some sort of ministry that required a knowledge of the scriptures, and my wife agreed, and we took off to go to seminary in Chicago. And when we got there, she got a job easily. She's an optician, so she found a job pretty quickly. I needed to find a part-time job to pull my weight, and so I looked for a part-time job, and I was told about a job that seemed perfect. It's in the suburbs of Chicago, and it was at a large YMCA. A lot of YMCAs in Chicago, at least there were at that time. And this was a very largest YMCA I'd ever seen, and they were looking for someone to join their staff. So I decided to go interview. And when I got there, I thought, this is so perfect for me. Being delusionally confident, I thought, they'll probably make me director. I've got my bachelor's degree in business administration. I played professional sports. I am a Christian, and at that time, I think the C in YMCA still meant Christian. So I'm perfect for this job. So I sat down and I interviewed with a great deal of confidence, and I got the job. But I wasn't the director. My job was towel boy. I passed out towels. Now, even worse than that. That was demeaning enough, but I wasn't even senior towel boy. There was a guy there that had seniority over me, and this was large enough YMCA. They had a men's locker room and a boys' locker room, and he had the men's locker room sewn up. So my job was to pick up towels from kids at the end of the day, put them in a basket and get them washed and get them ready for the next day. It was the fall of the year. In fact, it was the very first day of the World Series. And I was waiting for some young knuckleheads to stop snapping each other with their towels and all that kind of stuff. And because I had to go home, but I couldn't leave until I had picked up all the towels. And my coworker turned on the radio, and he turned on the World Series game. And it came over the speaker as I was sitting in a blue molded plastic chair. And in that particular year, one of the teams was the Baltimore Orioles. And I had just spent 3 years playing in the Baltimore Orioles organization. And I had worked my way up through the system to the top until they realized that's the wrong direction, and they sent me back down and helped me with my calling. I've always appreciated that. They said, "We don't know what your calling is, but we know what it's not." And so I exited. As they called out the names, because it used to be, I don't know how it is, but in the first game of the World Series, they announce all of the players. And I'm listening over the radio, and they're naming every one of the players. And in my mind's eye, I see them running out and lining up on the foul line. And just about every name they called were guys that I knew. Guys that I had practiced with, guys that I had told jokes with, guys that I had taken bus trips with. And they named, and as they named each one over the radio, I sunk lower and lower in my chair, watching boys throw towels on the floor and thinking what glory I had missed out on. So I threw a party. You ever had one of those parties? You're the only one invited, and and as I did, God spoke to me. Not an audible voice, but it was as clear as just about anything I can remember in my experience with the Lord over the years. And as I'm sitting there in the chair, it went something like this. So Gary, you came here to study theology because you want to represent me on the earth. Well, I want you to know something. This is the most important lesson you're going to learn in seminary. Yeah, you're going to learn how to handle Greek verbs and Hebrew verbs, but more importantly, you better learn how to handle a towel. So stoop down and pick up those towels. I wish I could tell you that's the last time I've had a similar conversation like that with the Lord. But it was a very humbling moment to me, and I learned a very important lesson, and I want to convey that to you here this morning in a story that's found within John's gospel. It's a story that you already know, but I want to take some time this morning and look at that and see what it is that Jesus is trying to teach his disciples, because the lesson that he's going to teach them in the upper room is very similar to the lesson he was teaching me in that locker room. John chapter 13, I'm going to read it to you, and if you have a Bible, you'd like to mark it up, that's a good idea. If not, we'll put it on the screen. But here's what John 13 says. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. It's a long, complicated sentence, isn't it? And some people debate, love them to the end. Does that mean love them till he died? Or I think it means love them with as much love as anybody can ever be loved. He loved them to the uttermost. And it says, during supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas to betray him, Jesus, notice this in verse 3, Jesus knew three things. It says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, that he had come from God, and that he was going back to God, rose from supper, laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied around his waist, poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Did you hear what it says in verse 3? Jesus knew three things. He knew where he came from. He came from God. He knew he was going back to God, and he knew that while he was here, he had everything he needed to accomplish his mission. Could I suggest to you, you can know that? Do you know where you came from? I'm not talking about Indiana or somewhere. You came from God. I just love seeing these kids up here. I just look at those faces and just the life that's in them, and I just think how precious each one of them is, that they were conceived in the mind of God long before they were conceived in their mother's womb. Each one has come from God. You have too. And when this is over, guess where you're going? You're going back to God. And in the meantime, he has given you, it's said multiple places in Scripture, that he has given you everything necessary for life and godliness. He who did not spare his own son, Paul says, but delivered him up for us all, how will he not also with him freely give us all things? It's the same things that he's talking about, that Jesus knew he had. So knowing that, here's the deal. Jesus had nothing to lose. He doesn't have to protect his reputation. He doesn't have to protect anything. He knows where he came from, he knows where he's going, and he knows what he's got to get it done. And you and I can know that too, and then we can stop posing because we got nothing to lose. So then it goes on, and it says in verse 6, he came to Simon Peter, and he said, Simon Peter said, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered him, what I'm doing, you don't understand now, Peter, but afterward you will understand. And Peter said to him, never, it's pushed forward for emphasis, never shall you wash my feet. And Jesus answered him, if I don't wash you, you have no share with me. And Peter said to him, okay, Lord, then not only my feet, but my hands too, and go ahead and get my head while you're at it. And Jesus said to him, Peter, the one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean. Not every one of you. He's, of course, talking about Judas. And then it says, verse 12, when he had washed their feet and put back on his outer garments, he said, do you understand what I have done to you? That's a good question for us this morning. Do you understand why this story is here? Do you understand that on the last night of Jesus' life, when there's no doubt we could learn a lot of things about what happened and all of the drama, do we understand why Jesus did this? And I hope you will when we get done, because there are two levels to this understanding. You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. Truly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Now, as I said, there are two lessons to this story. Lesson one is very simple. If we are serious about participating with God in his mission, we need to learn to stoop. If this church is going to be serious about the mission to love all and help all follow Jesus, then this church is going to have to become known for the basin and the towel. That's the most obvious interpretation or understanding of the passage. The only ones who qualify for such a high calling are those who know how to stoop. And I'm amazed when I think about it. And if some of you struggle at times trying to think, why is Christianity any better than any other religion? I don't think it's a matter of better, but why is it the truth while there are others that have sort of counterfeit truth? Just think of this. How is God pictured in the other religions? Because here's the amazing thing about Christianity. It just blows me away. We serve a God who stoops. You don't find that in many religions. In most religions, it's a God who is to be feared and who's angry. And if he's not angry, you don't know what he is because he's so mysterious. And the Bible presents a God who serves, a serving God. So the first lesson, that's probably the lesson that I would say is the surface lesson of the story is that Jesus is teaching his disciples, if you're going to follow me, then you're going to be a servant to others, because that's why I came. But there's a deeper lesson, and the one that I really want to spend time on the rest of our time together here is this, that you will not succeed in your mission without an abundant supply of God's grace. You will not succeed in your mission upon this planet unless you have a firm grip on God's grace. When Aaron asked me to come, I thought, well, what do I preach about? Well, the one thing is sort of my go-to subject is grace, because I find so many Christian people do not have a very firm grip on grace. So hopefully you will when we get finished with this. Now, the reason God's grace is so important, and I want you to know this, it's because there's only one kind of Christian. And this is the reality of the gospel. There's only one kind of Christian. The falling down, failing constantly person who's clinging desperately to the grace of God. There aren't any other kind. I have nothing to offer, but God has everything I need. And so we're all like Peter here in John 13. Jesus not only modeled the mission for the disciples, but he showed them what it would take to be successful, and it's all in his interaction with Peter, which was designed, by the way, by Jesus to show them this. So let's look at this story a little deeper. Verse 6 of John 13. Jesus now is going to wash the disciples' feet. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I read the passage, you picture it in your mind, but you're not there, so you don't really know exactly the details. But I have a feeling when Jesus kind of takes off his outer garments and he kneels down and starts washing feet, how do you picture the response? I mean, what's going on in that room at that moment? I think it's like crickets. Everybody's going, what's he doing? And he came to Simon Peter. And Simon Peter says to Jesus immediately, Lord, you're going to wash my feet? Now, you can read between the lines on that. He's not saying, Lord, all these other guys probably need their feet washed, but I'm good. It's probably not what he meant by that. He probably meant, Lord, I'm feeling really uncomfortable here because I should be washing your feet, and you're washing mine? By the way, if you've ever done a foot washing, those of you that have done a foot washing, I think you'll agree with me. The question is, which is easier, to wash someone's feet or to have your feet washed? If you're like me, it's a whole lot easier for you to wash somebody else's feet. Because you know what? When I'm washing someone else's feet, I'm in charge. And when someone's washing my feet, I don't know how to respond. And so Peter just says, Lord, you wash my feet? The first thing I want you to see here in Peter's response is we do this as well. Like Peter, we often question the grace of God. Some of you this morning, you question the grace. You are pretty good about, I've messed up my life so much, I don't know how God could put up with me. Actually, the sad thing is a lot of people that think that way are not in here this morning. A lot of people avoid the church like the plague because that's how they feel. I've actually had people say to me, I'd like to come to church, but I'm afraid if I walk in the church, the walls will fall down or something. I'm just a sinner. And I've always said, well, you'd be real comfortable at the churches I go to then. I don't know what it was about my pastoral career, but I never pastored a church where everybody who walked in the door wasn't a sinner. So, Lord, you wash my feet. Why is it so hard for us to just accept the grace of God? And I think you know the answer, but I'll just Say it out loud. Grace insults my pride. Especially if you're an American and you live in this country and you pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps and you know there's no such thing as a free lunch and you've got to work hard or else you're just a freeloader. Some of these guys that are smarter than I have said some really interesting things about grace. Like, for example, R.C. Sproul says this: it's difficult for our pride to rest on grace. Grace is for other people, for beggars. We don't want to live by a heavenly welfare system. We want to earn our way and atone for our own sins. We like to think that we will go to heaven because we deserve to be there. Randy Alcorn says, because grace is so incomprehensible to us, we bootleg in conditions so we won't look so bad and God's offer won't seem so counterintuitive. By the time we're done qualifying the gospel, we're no longer unworthy and powerless. We're just misguided souls. We're no longer wretches, and grace is no longer grace. Tim Keller, such a poignant observation. If you want to become a Christian, all you need is nothing. But most people don't have that. Most of us come with our recommendation letters, our resume, our morality, our money. Man, grace is tough to get a grip on. But if we're going to be useful to Jesus, we better have a grip on grace. So Peter makes his first mistake. He questions the grace of God. If you know Peter, you know that he's a Trinitarian mistake maker. He makes them in threes. So his second mistake here is after that, in verse 8, Peter says to Jesus, "Never shall you wash my feet." First, he questions the grace of God. Then he refuses the grace of God. Well, now what, Peter? How are you going to save yourself? How are you going to mature yourself? How are you going to get what you need to fulfill the purpose that God has for you? And where are you going to find the strength to keep going when it would be so much easier to quit? And if you could do any of this in your own strength, then the cross is unnecessary and grace is nullified. Because here's my definition of grace. Grace is God doing for us what we could never do for ourselves. You can't save yourself. By the way, don't tell your pastor that I spoke a little heresy this morning. Do you know there's two ways to be saved? The first way to be saved is to be absolutely perfect. How's that plan working for you? I was moved by what Nicole said this morning, talking about how she felt like she had to be perfect. How exhausting is that? So Peter now refuses the grace that Jesus is. What Jesus is trying to say to these guys is, guys, look, sit back. There are some things I need to do for you. So just receive these things. See, you may be here this morning and you say, man, I'm a mess. Yeah, and you don't say this to other people necessarily, but somehow in that self-talk, in those personal conversations, because that person you're talking to more than anybody else, which is you, you're saying, man, I'm a loser. I've tried everything. I tried to be good. I tried to do I tried to be a good Christian, try to be a good husband, try to be a good dad, try to be, man, I just keep making the same mistakes. And you get down on yourself. Or there's people around you, like I say, who are not here this morning because they've already given up. And so Peter says, no, never are you going to wash my feet. I'm going to do it myself. It reminds me of my youngest grandson who's constantly, when I'm trying to help him, me do it. Me do it. No, dude, you can't do it. I'm a patient grandfather. I do it. I have a feeling what happens in the upper room, because it doesn't tell us the dynamics, but I think I know the dynamics. It's very quiet in that room now. And Peter says, never will you wash my feet. And I picture what happened next. I think what happened next is the look. My mom, gracious lady, probably way too permissive as a mother and let us get away with murder. But there was a time, if you pushed the wrong button, my mom never said a word. She just gave us the look. And we knew what the look meant. Don't, you're done. Don't go any farther. And I think Jesus gives Peter the look. And then he says this, Peter, verse 8, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. If you don't accept my grace, if you don't let me do for you what you can't do for yourself, then you will. Now listen, he's not saying, because he's going to make it clear in a second, he's not saying you're no longer a Christian, you're no longer a disciple. What he's saying is you will not be able to participate with me if you don't learn to receive my grace. This thought came to me as I was preparing this, and it's kind of a bizarre thought. But even as I tell my opening story about how I wanted to serve the Lord, this is the language we often use. I just want to serve Jesus. I just want to serve God. Well, how does that square with a statement that Jesus made when he said, I didn't come to be served? Think about that. He said, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve and to give my life a ransom for many. So when we say, I just want to serve Jesus, sometimes I think Jesus might say, I didn't come to be served. Now, let me just say, it's not wrong. Obviously, he's Lord of the universe. It's respectful to realize, look, I want to do for him what makes him happy. But I think what Jesus is trying to get across to Peter here is, Peter, I want you to participate with me. When Jesus says, I didn't come to be served, I came to participate with you in serving others, in demonstrating the nature of the God who created us. And so he says to Peter, unless you let me wash your feet, you're not going to be able to participate with me. And so Peter makes his third mistake. At first he questions the grace of God, and then he refuses the grace of God, and now he's gotten the look. And in verse 9, he says, okay, I give. Lord, not just my feet then, but kind of do my hands while you're at it. Do my head while you're at it. Just give me a bath. And Jesus said to him, the one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. He's talking about Judas. In other words, he's saying you don't need to get saved over and over and over again. All you need to do is walk in the freedom of what I've done for you, but occasionally you'll lose sight of that. You'll get your feet dirty. Come back to me on a regular basis. Confess that. And as 1 John says, if you confess your sins, I'm faithful, just to forgive your sins and to cleanse you from all unrighteousness. So make it a habit. So, the question is, this morning, as we come in for a landing, how do I get God's grace? Paul says to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1, Timothy, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. I used to look at that over and over again and go, what in the world does that mean? How do I'm going to be strong in grace. Peter figured it out. Remember in the story, Jesus says to him, Peter, you don't understand what I'm doing right now, But later, you're going to understand, well, guess what? Peter got it. How do we know that? Because he wrote this book in the Bible called 1 Peter. And in 1 Peter, as an old man, maybe even looking back on this night, he says, God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Therefore, he says, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time. Humble yourself. Trust me, you don't get grace unless you're humble, so therefore you either humble yourself voluntarily, or as I've experienced, you probably have too, God will humble you involuntarily. And that's a little more painful. So we're going to close this morning by basking in God's grace. He has grace for you. And we're going to request God's grace by humbling ourselves, by recognizing our own limitations. This is why the Apostle Paul, who was very capable, and there's a man who was very proud in his early life, and finally in 2 Corinthians 12, he admits that he has this conversation with God, that God spoke to him and said to him, you know what, Paul? I know you're a very gifted individual, but none of that means a thing to me. You know what you need? You need one thing. Have you ever heard this verse? My grace is sufficient for you. For power is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, Paul says, I would rather boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. That's a tough verse, folks. You know what? I don't want to be weak. Nobody wants to be weak. We do everything we can to cover up our weaknesses. I spent 3 years playing professional baseball trying to hide my weaknesses, but eventually, when I went 0 for August, they couldn't be hidden anymore. I don't know how you try to hide. You try to hide behind your title. Try to hide behind somehow the family you belong to, the church you belong to, the stuff you have. Paul says, I want to be open about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. God is glorified through our weaknesses. And my weakness is a platform for God's strength. A very famous missionary statesman by the name of Hudson Taylor, who started China Inland Mission and had tremendous, was well respected and saw tremendous things as God worked through him on the mission field. One time a person asked why, in his opinion, China Inland Mission had thrived under his leadership. And Hudson Taylor said something, and I love this. He said, it seemed to me that God looked over the whole world to find a man who was weak enough to do his work, and when at last he found me, he said, he's weak enough, he'll do. And could I say to you this morning, you'll do too. You'll do. If you keep a firm grip on the grace of God. It was a couple years ago when God spoke to me again about this whole issue. I'm a slow learner. He showed me the beauty of his relentless grace. And we were at a birthday celebration. A friend of ours, her birthday is the same day as mine, and so her husband, he threw a once-in-a-lifetime. It was one of those 0 birthdays, the big deal. He threw a big celebration on their ranch in Hill Country area, and he went all out. He built a barn. He built a dance floor. He hired a country western band. He had caterers. It was unbelievable. And because her birthday's the same day as mine, I showed up saying, thank you. Thank you for throwing me this party. It was amazing. And so they had this great time scheduled out, and so we went to the barn dance. And he had a country western band, and he had a guy, I don't know what you call him, like a square dance caller type guy, that was teaching country dancing. I don't know anything about country dancing, although when I was laid up with COVID a couple years ago, I got addicted to country dancing, and my wife had to put me in a two-step group, so sorry, I had to throw one groaner out there. But we're dancing, and I don't know about you men, but for me, I mean, I'd rather run 5 miles than dance. And a lot of guys like me, I can do it, and I went out there. My wife likes it, so I go out there and, do what I'm expected to do, but it doesn't take long before I just got to sit down. I mean, it's just, and I'm learning to Cotton Eye Joe, and I'm thinking I'm picking up on it pretty good, And so I go over and sit down on this low wall, and my wife comes and joins me, and we're watching people dance. And there's a guy out there that's like the worst dancer I've ever, I mean, he didn't have any rhythm, and he was just bouncing around out there. And he was dancing with a younger woman, and it looked like his daughter, and it turned out it was his daughter, and it was obvious the way she was dancing that this is a hereditary problem because she was doing about the same thing. And I'm making all of these judgments in your mind. I'm good at that, by the way. I'm good at snap judgments. And I'm thinking to myself, what's he doing out there? And then my wife turns to me and she says, isn't that wonderful? This is not what I want to hear from her. Did she not see me out there? And you call that wonderful? Now, this is all going on in my head. I'm not saying anything, but I am a little curious. Why is this wonderful? So before I even say anything, she could tell I'm a little puzzled. And she says, oh, you don't know. I said, I don't know what. That man had a brain aneurysm about 6 months ago. They didn't think he'd ever walk again. And he came to the party, and he couldn't wait to dance with his little girl. And she's copying every move because it's her daddy. First, I wanted to find a hole. But then I said, thank you, Lord. That's grace. See, God looked down at our plight, and he saw what sin had done to us. Our brains are scrambled. Our bodies are wasting away. Our souls are afflicted with a mortal wound that we cannot recover from on our own. And rather than just abandon us, he accommodated himself to us and sent his only begotten, nail-scarred son who came and took our place on the cross. He experienced the same kind of humanity that we experience, the same kind of forces of evil. And he invites us to dance. Oh. That's grace. And it's yours for the taking. When my daughter, who's, I don't know how old, late 30s now, she was in high school. I'm not a country western music fan, but I noticed she had a country western music song in a frame, and it was in her bedroom. I didn't pay much attention to it for quite a while, and then one day I stopped and read it, and I thought, oh, these are beautiful words. One of the verses says this: I hope you still feel small when you stand beside the ocean. Whenever one door closes, I hope one more opens. Promise me that you'll give faith a fighting chance. Promise me that you'll give grace a fighting chance. And when you get the choice to sit it out or dance, oh, I hope you dance. Father, thank you so much for the invitation. And I pray that you'll look into every heart, each and every one of us, and reveal to us those areas where we have been trying to do it on our own, been trying to fix ourselves, been trying to fix everybody else around us. And Lord, this morning before we leave, as we humble ourselves before you, give us a vice-like grip on your grace. So the worship team comes and plays over you. I just want to invite you, take a moment and think about what you've heard. And is there any area of your life that you could just open up to the Lord about and say, Lord, I recognize my weakness in this area. And I'm not going to waste my time trying to cover it up, not going to waste my time trying to fix it on my own. I just want to confess it to you. Because you oppose the proud, but you give abundant grace to the humble. So take a moment and talk to your Heavenly Father, and then Drew will close us out.